how did we get here? Now, we ask that question about topics all the time. But when we see what's happening in the United States right now, well, that is a very big topic, isn't it? This fall is a highly consequential presidential election. And for people everywhere, the issue of choice is top of mind. The overturning of Roe v. Wade continues to have huge consequences. But even though many Americans don't fully understand how it all happened, well, that is something our next guest has been researching. Elizabeth Dias is the national religion correspondent for the New York Times and co-author of The Fall of Roe and joins us now. Elizabeth, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, in your research, when do you think the real downfall for Roe v. Wade actually began?
It's such a good question because really in many ways, the fall began the day after Roe was decided 50 years ago. But, the anti-abortion movement here in the U.S. Has been led by conservative Christians for decades. But it was really only about 10 years ago that after 40 years, they started to gain traction. And what my co-author, Lisa Lerer, at the New York Times and I document in the book is over the last 10 years, there was this radicalization, slow and consistent within the movement. They were, of course, really had some lucky breaks with the election of former President Donald Trump. But this was a movement that thinks in generations, right? They don't just think in political cycles or short 2 or 4 year periods. They were committed with this sense of deep conviction, believing that they were fighting what they talked about as the biggest moral fight of the modern age, which was a minority position and one that they were absolutely committed to. And so incrementally, there are all these little decisions, all these small moments in state legislatures, in activist circles, in courthouses, in states across the country that really, while so many people were not paying attention, built up to what became one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in U.S. history, which ended the constitutional right to an abortion, which so many women had come to rely on as just a foundation of their lives and how they do or don't build their families.
And this is even though in every Supreme Court justice confirmation hearing that I have watched in my lifetime, this was a topic that they got asked about, and there was no way yet it still happened.
Yes. I mean, like you said, in all of these hearings in the Senate, the nominees, were asked what did they think about the Roe v. Wade decision, and they over again, appointed by Democrats as well and Republican presidents, they would say, that Roe was the Supreme
law of the land,
and would be law of the land, respected as such. But the thing that people don't really think about is that precedents can change. And it's really rare it's so exceedingly rare for a Supreme Court decision to be overturned. But it is true that a victory for one movement can become a defeat, and a victory for a very different movement with a very different vision for America's future over time.
Elizabeth, do Americans fully understand that long journey that you just talked about there? Because I've seen polls that show that there are people in the United States who believe that Joe Biden is responsible for this.
It's actually a reason we wrote this book, because there hasn't been one real clear narrative outlining the facts of what has happened, especially over this last transformational decade, which we talk about in the book as the last decade, the final decade of the Roe era in American life. But it's easy to see this kind of in piecemeal if you're seeing it at all, from a partisan perspective, or there's this deluge of laws being passed, court cases over these years, and it's really hard to put together, even for journalists like us who, cover this for most of our careers. So this book, it really is the first narrative of this time period, taking a nonpartisan look at what happened, what was the movement on the right that pushed to end abortion rights, What did the left really not do? What's the critical look kind of what were their failures and what they missed along the way? What a majority of just the American public didn't see, during this time period. And it's a really it's a wild thing as a journalist. You're writing what we talk about is kind of the first draft of history, and a book like this, let us take that step back and try to put everything together to see, okay, what did this mean about where America actually has been and where is the country going in the future?
Was there a tipping point at some point in the last, 5 years, 6 years that this became inevitable?
Yes. Well, obviously, the election of former President Trump was a turning point for so many things. And for anti-abortion activists, they leaned in to support him when so many other Republicans at the time leaned away. They were able to get influential and small influential positions across the administration when he was president. They showed up. They were the masters of taking every opportunity to their advantage, even if they weren't sure how it would pan out. But you can't really compete with the nomination of 3 Supreme Court justices. They were right. That did change the court for a generation. But that wouldn't have happened kind of without all of these this pushing forward incrementally for all of these years that they really worked toward, and then with some really big. Almost they would call them lucky breaks, or for many in that movement, they might talk about it as kind of like a divine intervention almost, because for so many of the, especially Catholics and some evangelicals who were leaders in this movement, there is a spiritual story to this too, right? So while they were able to find the levers of power and pull them, they also see a much bigger spiritual story that the majority of the country here doesn't see or doesn't agree with.
Right. So fascinating. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us today.
Really appreciate your interest in the topic and the book. Thank you.
The book sounds fascinating. That's Elizabeth Dias, national religion correspondent for the New York Times, co-author of the book, The Fall of Roe, which is actually available today.